And the whole screw job happened. Part of me could never believe that they would do that to me after as hard as I worked for them. And some of you guys come up, like Viral Vader came up to me about 20 minutes before my match. He goes, they're gonna screw you in the match. I know it.
He knew what Vince McMahon really was beneath the surface, and Bret Hart tried desperately to warn everyone in the World Wrestling Federation locker room before it all came crashing down in the most spectacular and destructive way imaginable. In 2024, corporate boards at the newly formed TKO Group Holdings started systematically treating Vince McMahon like a toxic liability, instead of celebrating him as the legendary architect who built the modern wrestling empire from absolutely nothing. The brand that he personally constructed over 4 decades of relentless work began methodically erasing him from its carefully crafted corporate identity. Decades upon decades of being universally called a genius promoter and visionary businessman vanished almost overnight when the cascade of horrific scandals broke wide open and became impossible to ignore or cleverly spin away. The publicly traded company that once proudly constructed its entire corporate persona and highly successful television product around his Mr. McMahon heel character suddenly and definitively wanted absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with him or his increasingly controversial legacy. Board meetings at TKO explicitly discussed detailed strategies for removing his presence from historical content and archival footage. Strategic planning sessions with nervous investors centered entirely on methodically distancing the valuable brand from his increasingly radioactive personal legacy. The man who created the modern sports entertainment empire and made professional wrestling a legitimate billion-dollar global business became persona non grata in his own kingdom. And here is the uncomfortable thing that nobody in the wrestling industry wants to publicly admit, even now. Bret Hart saw this exact scenario playing out in real time back in 1997. He warned the entire locker room explicitly and repeatedly that loyalty to Vince McMahon was strictly a one-way transaction that would never, ever be reciprocated when times got tough or when loyalty became inconvenient. He looked his rivals directly in their faces and told them with absolute certainty that they would eventually be discarded like yesterday's garbage the precise moment they stopped generating significant revenue for the company or became even slightly inconvenient to manage. He predicted with genuinely eerie accuracy the complete moral collapse that would eventually consume and utterly destroy the McMahon empire from within. Nobody listened to a single word he said back then. They arrogantly dismissed him as bitter and unable to adapt to changing times. They condescendingly called him difficult to work with and hopelessly stuck in the past. They smugly said he could not let go of outdated traditions and accept that the business was evolving beyond him. But Bret was not bitter about losing his spot on top. He was simply early in recognizing the destructive pattern. He saw the fundamental corruption before anyone else in that locker room even recognized it was systematically taking over the entire company culture. So what exactly did Bret see that everyone else in the entire wrestling world consciously chose to ignore? And why did an entire locker room absolutely full of tough competitors and alpha personalities allow this massive betrayal to happen without putting up any meaningful fight whatsoever? And if you want to support this important story and help other wrestling fans finally understand what really happened behind the scenes all those years ago, hit the hype feature on this video right now. It pushes the algorithm favorably and helps significantly more people see the documented truth as we systematically break down in meticulous detail exactly what Bret saw coming decades before anyone else recognized the pattern. To properly understand why Bret Hart's specific warning carried so much credibility and weight with those who chose to listen, you absolutely need to first understand exactly who Bret Hart was to professional wrestling in the mid-1990s. He was categorically not some bitter outsider standing on the sidelines, throwing baseless accusations purely for attention or personal revenge. He was not a disgruntled former employee with a personal axe to grind after being unceremoniously fired from the company. He was not some mark who never truly understood how the wrestling business actually worked behind the curtain. He was the biological son of the legendary Stu Hart, personally trained from childhood in the genuinely legendary Hart Dungeon facility in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. The dungeon was legitimately old school in every possible sense of that often overused phrase. It systematically taught absolute respect for the wrestling business above absolutely everything else in your entire entire life. It relentlessly drilled into every single student the critical importance of maintaining strict professionalism even when cameras were not rolling and nobody outside the business was watching your behavior. It emphasized protecting the business and faithfully maintaining kayfabe as sacred duties that could never be violated under any circumstances whatsoever. Bret grew up completely immersed in a very specific world where your handshake genuinely meant something permanent and binding, where signed contracts were universally treated as sacred bonds that could never be broken without completely destroying your reputation forever in the industry, and where betraying another performer was universally considered the absolute worst sin you could possibly commit within the tight fraternity. By 1996, Bret was objectively not just another talented wrestler on the roster competing desperately for limited television time. He was the reigning WWF champion and the company's single most reliable main event star who could legitimately draw money across multiple international markets. He was clean-cut and family-friendly enough to confidently represent the brand in mainstream media appearances without embarrassment. He was technically brilliant and genuinely innovative in the ring and could consistently have outstanding, critically acclaimed matches with literally anyone on the card, regardless of their personal style or limitations. He was absolutely beloved in Canada, where he was genuinely treated as a legitimate national hero, on par with beloved hockey players. He was massively over and genuinely popular in Europe, where technical scientific wrestling was culturally appreciated far more than anywhere else in the world. He represented everything that was traditional and honorable about professional wrestling as an art form: integrity over convenient shortcuts, genuine hard work over manipulative political games, and backstage maneuvering. Doing business the right way, even when cutting corners, might have been significantly easier and more immediately profitable. In an industry that was absolutely full of massive, fragile egos and toxically destructive backstage politics, Bret Hart was universally viewed as the safe choice, the reliable guy you could confidently trust with your most important main event spot, the proven performer who would never embarrass the company on a controversial talk show or break his contractual promises when a financially better offer inevitably came along from a competitor. That hard-earned reputation for reliability and personal honor made what happened next even more viscerally devastating and genuinely shocking to everyone who personally witnessed it unfold. In 1996, the World Wrestling Federation found itself in genuinely serious financial trouble for the first time in well over a decade of consistent market dominance. World Championship Wrestling, backed by seemingly unlimited Turner Broadcasting money and corporate resources, was systematically raiding WWF talent by aggressively offering guaranteed multi-year contracts the struggling promotion simply could not afford to match financially. WCW was decisively dominating television ratings every single Monday night, with the revolutionary New World Order angle that successfully captured genuine mainstream media attention beyond wrestling fans. The NWO storyline featuring Hulk Hogan, shockingly cast as a villain, was genuinely revolutionary and felt fresh compared to the increasingly stale WWF product. Meanwhile, the WWF television product increasingly felt outdated and predictable to a rapidly growing number of fans who were actively changing the channel to watch the competition. The company was actively cancelling expensive house shows all across North America because disappointing ticket sales could not economically justify the substantial travel and production costs involved. Internal financial memos circulated discussing cutting costs everywhere possible to stop the financial bleed. Wrestlers backstage were legitimately worried about their professional futures and whether their paychecks would continue reliably clearing at the bank. The very real possibility of bankruptcy was being seriously discussed in private conversation. Vince McMahon desperately needed to keep his top remaining stars from jumping ship to the surging competition. The steady talent exodus to WCW was accelerating dramatically and showed absolutely no signs of slowing down naturally without major financial intervention. So, in October 1996, Vince offered Bret Hart something completely unprecedented in the entire documented history of professional wrestling: a 20-year contract. Not a standard 2-year deal, not even an extended 5-year deal, 20 full years, an entire generation of employment. The deal was specifically and carefully designed to make Bret the Babe Ruth of professional wrestling, a lifetime figure whose association with the WWF brand would authentically span multiple generations of fans. The intricate contract structure was genuinely clever from a business perspective. It would pay Bret enormous guaranteed sums during his prime physical years, when he could still credibly main event major pay-per-views pay-per-views and draw big houses in arenas worldwide. Then it would gradually transition him into a permanent long-term role as a trainer in developmental territories, an ambassador representing the company at important corporate events and international promotional appearances, and a respected locker room leader who could mentor and guide younger developing talent through the business. The total contract was valued at roughly $52 million, spread strategically across 2 full decades. It was an absolutely enormous financial commitment that clearly demonstrated how much Vince supposedly genuinely valued Bret as a cornerstone of the company's future. But Bret Hart had another very real and extremely lucrative option on the table that he was seriously considering as a legitimate alternative. WCW had officially offered him a guaranteed 3-year deal at $9 million total. That worked out to significantly more money per year than the front-loaded WWF deal if you carefully calculated the annual average specifically during the active wrestling phase. But the WCW offer provided absolutely no long-term security beyond those initial 3 years. No contractual promises whatsoever about what would happen when his body inevitably could no longer handle the extreme physical demands of main event wrestling. No guarantees about transitioning into backstage roles or ongoing employment after retirement. Bret faced a genuinely difficult choice that would define the entire rest of his professional life and personal legacy. Immediate money right now versus long-term security forever. Short-term wealth versus generational stability. The notoriously cutthroat political environment of WCW versus the supposed close-knit family atmosphere of the WWF. After extensive soul-searching and consultation, Bret chose the WWF. He consciously chose stability and loyalty over immediate cash. He deliberately chose what he genuinely believed was a family relationship rather than just a cold business transaction. He trusted Vince completely when Vince looked him directly in the eye and sincerely said this was a permanent partnership that would authentically last forever, that Bret would retire many years from now as a proud WWF lifer and eventually be universally remembered as the face of the company for an entire important era of wrestling history. That monumental decision, made in complete good faith and with absolute trust in Vince's word, would come back to haunt Bret in ways he could never have possibly imagined in his worst nightmares. Less than 1 calendar year later, in the autumn of 1997, Vince McMahon walked into a private backstage meeting with Bret Hart and told him something that fundamentally shattered their relationship forever. He said he could not honor the 20-year deal they had ceremoniously signed together just months earlier. He claimed the company was teetering dangerously on the verge of complete bankruptcy and catastrophic financial collapse. He insisted he had developed severe buyer's remorse about the massive long-term financial commitment. He essentially told Bret directly to immediately start finding work somewhere else because the WWF could no longer afford to keep him on the roster at that salary level. But here is what made this betrayal so calculated and fundamentally dishonest. This was provably not a case of genuine financial hardship, forcing an unavoidable difficult decision under duress. The company's overall financial outlook was actually improving noticeably and measurably by late 1997. The Attitude Era was beginning to organically take shape with Stone Cold Steve Austin rapidly emerging as a genuine megastar. Austin was connecting powerfully with audiences in ways that felt authentic and fresh and new. Television ratings were starting to recover steadily from their historically lowest points. Merchandise revenue was increasing week by week as the product found new energy. The product was finding its creative footing under new direction. This transparently was not about corporate survival at all. This was an intentional and carefully calculated breach of contract designed to serve Vince's immediate interests. It was a cynical corporate maneuver specifically designed to escape a long-term financial obligation that Vince had unilaterally decided was inconvenient and regrettable. The underlying strategy was manipulative but effective in achieving its goal. Make the working situation uncomfortable enough that Bret would voluntarily want to leave. Make him personally carry the full burden and social awkwardness of finding a new employer while under contract. Frame the departure as a mutual decision rather than what it actually was, which was a unilateral abandonment of promises made barely 12 months earlier without cause. The destructive pattern that would define everything moving forward for the next 3 decades was already crystal clear if you knew where to look and what signs to recognize. The supposedly sacred family atmosphere that Vince constantly promoted was nothing but a carefully crafted illusion specifically designed to extract maximum loyalty from talent without ever having to reciprocate that loyalty when it became financially or strategically inconvenient. The fierce loyalty loyalty Bret demonstrated by turning down significantly more guaranteed money from WCW meant absolutely nothing. The precise moment Vince decided that honoring that loyalty was financially inconvenient or strategically unnecessary for the company's immediate bottom line. This was the first major crack in the foundation of trust. This was the exact moment when Bret realized the wrestling business he grew up in and believed in was fundamentally changing into something he did not recognize or respect. The traditionalist approach he believed in with every fiber of his being was being systematically replaced by something significantly colder and more calculating, something purely corporate, where personal relationships were reduced to transactions and signed contracts were treated as mere suggestions rather than binding obligations. And this massive fundamental shift in company culture was not just coming from Vince McMahon personally making isolated bad decisions. It was being actively driven and dramatically accelerated by a new political faction inside the company that was completely rewriting all the unwritten rules of backstage politics and power dynamics. The Kliq was a backstage political faction primarily led by Shawn Michaels and Triple H, with Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Sean Waltman rounding out the core membership. They introduced a completely new and toxic level of political maneuvering to the WWF locker room environment that had never existed before. Before the Kliq gained significant influence over booking and creative decisions, most wrestlers followed an unspoken code of professional conduct that maintained order. You worked cooperatively with management on finishes and storylines. You protected each other physically in the ring to prevent injuries. You respected the established hierarchy based on legitimate drawing power and tenure with the company. The Kliq systematically changed that entire culture almost overnight through aggressive political manipulation. They aggressively used their personal relationships with Vince McMahon and powerful backstage officials like Pat Patterson to directly influence booking decisions entirely in their favor. They consistently prioritized generating short-term shock value over protecting the long-term drawing power and credibility of the entire roster. They made the locker room feel cutthroat and political instead of collaborative and professional. Wrestlers who were not part of the inner circle found themselves struggling to get meaningful television time or storylines that could elevate their careers. The Kliq would openly mock and belittle other performers backstage, creating a toxic atmosphere that destroyed morale. Bret Hart saw this cultural shift as a fundamental betrayal of what professional wrestling was supposed to represent at its core. He viewed them as cancer destroying the business from within. Triple H became a particular target of Bret's increasingly vocal criticism over the years. Bret later called Triple H a phony and a slimeball who achieved his elevated status through manipulation and political games, rather than genuine merit or legitimate drawing power in the territory system. He suggested that Triple H's eventual marriage to Stephanie McMahon was the ultimate consolidation of unearned power gained through backstage politics rather than in ring excellence or paying legitimate dues. The marriage essentially guaranteed Triple H would never be fired regardless of his performance or behavior. In early 1997, the simmering tension between Bret Hart and the Kliq reached a genuine breaking point during a European tour. The company was performing in Germany, a market where Bret was exceptionally popular and drew tremendous houses consistently for years. Just 1 week before his historic WrestleMania 13 match against Stone Cold Steve Austin that would become legendary, management suddenly wanted Bret to lose cleanly and decisively to Triple H in the middle of the ring with no protection. Bret immediately refused the finish. He recognized it as a deliberate attempt to damage his credibility and diminish his drawing power right before a major pay-per-view match that the entire WrestleMania card was strategically built around. The timing was too suspicious to be coincidental. He forced Vince McMahon to change the finish to protect his character. This specific incident highlighted the growing philosophical divide, splitting the locker room into opposing camps. Bret believed in preserving the integrity and credibility of all performers, so they remained valuable assets who could draw money long-term for everyone's benefit. The Kliq believed in advancing their own inner circle at any cost and chasing shock value no matter the damage to others on the roster or the long-term health of the business. This is where Bret Hart's warning became completely explicit and impossible to ignore or misinterpret for anyone paying attention. He did not just complain privately to close friends backstage or vent years later in shoot interviews after retirement. He went directly to the specific people who were actively benefiting from the new political system that was destroying the traditional culture. He warned Shawn Michaels Michaels and Triple H repeatedly and explicitly that their current favor with Vince McMahon was purely temporary and entirely transactional in nature. He told them bluntly they were being used as disposable tools to generate revenue for the company. He said with absolute certainty that the precise moment they stopped being profitable or useful to the brand, Vince would discard them without a second thought or any hesitation whatsoever. Bret used a specific and memorable analogy that perfectly captured the disposable nature of the relationship. He said Vince McMahon would treat them exactly like a used piece of Kleenex, something you grab desperately when you need it for a specific purpose, then throw away carelessly in the trash without a second thought once it has served its immediate function. The warning was not just about hurt personal feelings or wounded pride. It was about identifying a fundamental systemic problem in how the company operated at its core that would eventually destroy everyone. Bret saw clearly that Vince carefully cultivated an atmosphere of family and loyalty, specifically to extract maximum sacrifice from his wrestlers. Performers would sacrifice their bodies, their health, their families, and lucrative outside opportunities because they genuinely believed in the bond and the supposed family relationship Vince promoted. But that bond was entirely one-sided and completely transactional from management's perspective. Vince McMahon's primary loyalty was always to the survival and profitability of the brand above all else. Contractual obligations and moral commitments would always be considered secondary to immediate financial performance and quarterly earnings reports for shareholders. Bret pointed to clear historical precedent to support his warning. He noted that Vince had shown little genuine sentimentality when systematically phasing out older legends or performers who were past their physical prime earning years. Everyone's career had a definite expiration date in management's eyes, regardless of their tenure or past contributions to building the company into what it became. The almighty dollar was the only constant factor that truly mattered in every single decision, and what was about to happen in Montreal would prove Bret Hart's warning in the most brutal and public way possible. By November 1997, Bret Hart had signed a lucrative $3 million per year guaranteed contract with World Championship Wrestling. He was contractually set to leave the WWF on November 1st and begin working for the competition, but he was still the reigning WWF champion, holding the top title in the company. Vince McMahon wanted him to lose the championship to Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series in Montreal, Canada. Bret flat out refused to do the job in that specific circumstance. The refusal was not about ego or being unwilling to lose. Bret and Shawn Michaels had deep personal animosity that had crossed from professional rivalry into genuinely hostile hatred that everyone backstage witnessed daily. Their relationship was toxic and irreparable at that point. Bret Hart was a legitimate national hero in Canada, treated with the same reverence and respect as beloved hockey players who won Olympic gold. Losing to Shawn Michaels in his home country, in front of his own people who idolized him, felt like a profound humiliation he absolutely could not accept. More importantly, Bret did not trust Shawn Michaels to treat the moment with professional respect given their documented history of conflict and Shawn's known behavior. Bret offered numerous reasonable alternatives to resolve the situation honorably. He said he would lose the championship to literally anyone else on the entire roster. He offered to vacate the title on Monday Night Raw in Ottawa the following night on live television. He said he would lose it anywhere in the United States before Survivor Series. Vince McMahon rejected every single alternative option presented. He harbored a deep, irrational fear that Bret Hart would appear on WCW Monday Nitro, holding the WWF Championship, and publicly humiliate the company on live television in front of millions. This fear was amplified by the ongoing Monday Night Wars ratings battle and a previous incident where Alundra Blaze had thrown the WWF Women's title in a trash can on live WCW television in a humiliating publicity stunt. But Bret Hart had a well-documented and spotless reputation for professional integrity spanning his entire career. He had never broken a promise or violated the code of the business. The fear was not rational or justified by any evidence. It was an excuse to justify what came next. Triple H allegedly suggested directly to Vince McMahon that they should do business for Bret. That specific phrase became the internal justification. They would screw Bret Hart out of the title without his knowledge or consent. The mechanics of the betrayal required absolute secrecy and careful compartmentalization of information. Vince McMahon deliberately kept many people completely out of the loop so they would not have to lie directly to Bret's face and risk exposure of the plan. Jim Ross and Bruce Pritchard, two of the most trusted voices in the company, were not told about the plan. But once Shawn applied the hold, Vince McMahon appeared at ringside. He ordered Earl Hebner to ring the bell immediately. Bret Hart had not tapped out. Bret had not submitted. Bret had not given up. The bell rang anyway. Shawn Michaels was declared the new WWF champion. The crowd was confused and then outraged when they realized what happened. Bret spit directly in Vince McMahon's face at ringside. He violently smashed television monitors in fury. He spelled out the letters WCW in the air with his finger as a message. Later, in the dressing room, Bret confronted Vince McMahon and knocked him out cold with a devastating punch that left the chairman with a visible black eye that he wore for weeks. The Montreal Screwjob was not a spontaneous decision made in the heat of the moment. It was a carefully premeditated act of corporate betrayal, directed against an employee who was still working in complete good faith under his existing contract. And it validated absolutely everything Bret Hart had warned about. The immediate reaction in the WWF locker room was widespread shock and genuine outrage from nearly everyone. Many wrestlers immediately recognized that if someone with Bret Hart's stature and tenure could be betrayed so publicly and brutally, then nobody was truly safe from similar treatment. This was a genuinely rare moment when collective action and solidarity might have fundamentally changed the balance of power between talent and management forever. But the critical moment passed without meaningful action. Only one person actually followed through on principles. Mick Foley, known as Mankind at the time, refused to show up for Monday Night Raw in Ottawa the next night. He sat alone in a Montreal hotel room, disgusted and heartbroken by the profound disrespect shown to Bret Hart, a man he respected enormously as both a performer and a person. Foley's protest was an act of pure principle and moral courage, but it was tragically short-lived because of the reality of his situation. His wife reminded him that refusing to work was a direct breach of his contract. If he stayed home in protest, he would be legally prevented from earning a living anywhere else in the wrestling world for 5 full years due to strict non-compete clauses. With a young family to support, Foley reluctantly returned to work. He later said that one really is the loneliest number. The profound isolation of being the only person willing to stand on principle in a fundamentally unethical system. The Undertaker, viewed as the conscience of the locker room, also tried to force some measure of accountability. He physically made Vince McMahon confront Bret Hart face to face in the dressing room after the incident, essentially threatening Vince if he did not. But ultimately, The Undertaker stayed with the company and continued working despite his disgust. Bret Hart's warning was completely ignored in 1997 because people desperately wanted to believe in the comfortable illusion that Vince promoted through careful image management. They wanted to think Vince was a misunderstood genius making tough but necessary decisions for the greater good, that the wrestling business inherently required morally questionable choices to succeed commercially. That loyalty to the company meant blindly accepting whatever management decided was best for business. But loyalty is not supposed to flow in only one direction like water downhill. Integrity in keeping your word is not supposed to be viewed as a competitive weakness or naive traditionalism. No amount of profit or commercial success justifies systematically treating people as disposable assets to be used and discarded. Bret Hart stood firmly for the revolutionary idea that wrestling could be wildly successful and commercially dominant while also being honorable and ethical in its treatment of performers. That you did not have to lie and betray and destroy people to win in business or entertainment. That respecting your talent and keeping your contractual promises was not just morally right, but also genuinely sustainable for building long-term success that lasted. The fact that it took nearly 3 full decades for the rest of the world to finally see what Bret saw clearly in 1997 does not make him wrong about anything he said. It simply makes him early in recognizing the destructive pattern before it became undeniable. And now, as professional wrestling moves forward under new leadership and a completely new corporate structure, free from the McMahon influence, Bret Hart's integrity and principles remain a powerful model for how the business should operate moving forward into the future. The brand can rebuild itself on genuine respect instead of fear and intimidation. Fans can actively demand real accountability from companies instead of passively accepting exploitation as normal industry practice. Wrestlers can collectively insist that contracts mean something legally binding instead of being used and discarded when convenient for management. The future does not have to mindlessly repeat the mistakes of the past that destroyed so many lives and careers. Truth matters more than short-term profit margins. Loyalty should flow in both directions equally between employer and employee. And Bret Hart's warning, finally heard and understood after decades of being dismissed, can guide the entire industry toward building something genuinely better that honors both the performers and the fans. The lessons learned from Montreal and its aftermath are clear. Treating people with dignity and honoring commitments is not weakness. It is the foundation of sustainable success. The McMahon era proved that ruthlessness might generate short-term profits, but it eventually collapses under the weight of its own corruption. Bret Hart offered a different path, a path where success and integrity coexist, where loyalty is mutual, where promises mean something. That path was rejected in 1997, but it remains available now. So, if you found this story valuable and enlightening, hit the like button, subscribe for more deep wrestling history, and let us know in the comments section what other warnings were ignored in professional wrestling over the decades. Share this video with other wrestling fans who need to understand what really happened and why it matters for the future of the industry and the performers who risk everything to give everything to us. Because the truth always comes out eventually, no matter how long it takes or how deeply it gets buried by corporate spin and revisionist history and carefully managed public relations campaigns. And Bret Hart was right all along about everything he warned us about.
Got some kind of issue with you, I'll talk to you in the dressing room or something, but I'll never take those things to the ring. That's the time when you have to be professional. And I remember I said that to him, and I remember Shawn looked at me, and this is where it all came from, is he looked at me and said, well, I appreciate that, but I just want you to know that I'm not willing to do the same thing for you.
He knew. Bret Hart knew exactly what Shawn Michaels was. He said it out loud. He said it clearly, directly, and more than once. He warned the people in charge, and nobody listened. Not until a November night in Montreal proved every single word he had ever said was right. Before we get into the full story, if you are watching this right now and you feel like the world deserves to hear it, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. Push it out there. This is the kind of truth that deserves to travel as far as it possibly can. Let us talk about Shawn Michaels, because here is something that needs to be stated clearly before anything else. Before any of the politics, before any of the backstage maneuvering, before any of the betrayal. Shawn Michaels was genuinely brilliant at his craft. That is not a small concession. That is a fact that deserves to sit on its own for a moment. He had timing that felt almost supernatural. He had the kind of raw charisma that leapt off the screen and grabbed you before you even realized what had happened. When Shawn Michaels was truly on his game, he was as good as anyone who has ever laced up a pair of boots in this business. The matches he constructed in the mid-1990s are still discussed today as some of the finest ever produced anywhere in the world. He earned his position at the top of the card through genuine hard work and genuine talent. Nobody handed him any of it. He fought for every inch of it. He deserved full credit for all of it. But Bret saw something darker underneath all of that brilliance. He saw it clearly and he saw it early. So why did nobody listen until it was too late? To understand that question honestly, you have to understand who these two men actually were at their core. Because this was never simply a rivalry between two performers who personally disliked each other. This was a full collision between two completely different ideas about what professional wrestling was supposed to be, who it was supposed to serve, and what standards were supposed to govern the people performing it at the highest possible level. Bret Hart grew up inside wrestling. not beside it, not watching it from a comfortable and safe distance. Inside it, his father, Stu Hart, ran a training facility in Calgary that was known simply as the Dungeon. That name was not chosen for dramatic effect. It was accurate. The Dungeon was a place where the craft was transmitted through genuine physical suffering and relentless daily repetition, without or shortcut. Bret absorbed a very specific set of values there from a very young age. The most important thing a professional wrestler could do was protect the person standing across the ring from him. Every move, every hold, every planned exchange existed within a shared framework of mutual trust and mutual responsibility. You took care of your opponent, and your opponent took care of you in return. That was the professional code. It did not need to be written down anywhere. Every serious person in that locker room understood it from the moment they arrived. It was the foundation upon which everything else rested. Bret also believed deeply in the internal logic of the wrestling business itself. They were supposed to tell a complete story from beginning to middle to end. They were supposed to build in a way that made genuine emotional sense to the person watching from the audience. Crowd should feel as though what they were seeing was real, hard-earned, and genuinely uncertain in its outcome right up until the final moment. He was a craftsman in the truest and most demanding possible sense of that word. The pride he took in his work was enormous, and it came with a level of professional seriousness that some people found difficult to be around for extended periods. He was not there to produce surface spectacle. He was there to make you believe completely in what you were watching. This was the entire point. Shawn Michaels came from a different professional tradition entirely. He was dazzling, and he was entirely aware of it. He could flip and spin and land in ways that made audiences physically gasp out loud. He understood entertainment with what seemed almost like pure instinct rather than acquired knowledge. And around him formed a group that would become one of the most discussed backstage alliances in the modern history of wrestling. They were called the Kliq. Triple H, Razor Ramon, Diesel, Sean Waltman. These were men who looked out for one another before they looked out for the broader locker room around them. They understood how to read and use leverage inside a professional organization. They understood how to position themselves within a company's internal power structure to protect their spots and advance their individual interests over the long term. The unwritten rules of the locker room that Bret Hart had been raised from childhood to treat as sacred simply did not command the same respect or the same inside the Kliq's way of operating. That was the essential difference. Michaels believed in self-preservation above almost everything else in the professional environment. He believed in being the most valuable and the most irreplaceable person in any building he walked into on any given night. He believed that status earned at great personal cost was something you defended by whatever means were available to you at any given moment. Under the right conditions, that philosophy worked brilliantly and produced a performer of extraordinary quality. When a promoter genuinely needed a top star who could draw paying audiences through the doors on a consistent basis, Michaels delivered without question. But when his personal interests collided with the interests of the locker room surrounding him, same philosophy became something that ate steadily and quietly away at the foundations of the working environment for everyone else who had to be there every night. The WWF in the mid-1990s was operating under enormous financial pressure that colored every single decision management made. World Championship Wrestling, known as WCW, was surging in ways that were genuinely alarming to the people running the WWF. Television ratings were climbing week after week. Their roster was expanding at pace. They were pulling established talent from the WWF and presenting those performers as bigger stars than they had ever been allowed to become under McMahon. Vince McMahon was watching his company lose meaningful ground in a competitive war it had once dominated so completely that competition itself had seemed almost theoretic. That pressure made him increasingly desperate to retain his most valuable assets at almost any cost. Desperation made him willing to accept and tolerate behavior that a healthier and more confident organization would never have permitted to continue unchallenged. In late 1996, McMahon moved to secure Bret Hart's long-term commitment to the company. The contract he offered was genuinely significant, a 20-year agreement, real and substantial financial security, creative protections that gave Bret meaningful input into how he was presented and used. Bret signed, but there was a serious problem buried inside the decision that would generate consequences almost immediate. McMahon had previously made a verbal promise to Shawn Michaels. He had told Michaels that Michaels would remain the highest paid talent on the WF roster. Bret's new deal directly and unavoidably violated that promise. When Michaels found out about the terms Bret had received, he was furious. He and his father sat down with McMahon and formally requested a release from the company entirely. McMahon refused to grant it. Refusal ignited a chain reaction that played out over the following year in ways that led directly to the events in Montreal. Michaels felt that the company had broken its word to him in a fundamental way. He felt that his contributions and his loyalty had been valued less than those of a colleague. A sense of financial grievance sharpened his existing instinct to protect his position by whatever means were available to him. Bret watched this dynamic developing and went directly to management with his concerns. He told them clearly that allowing financial resentments to build and fester inside a locker room was not a manageable minor inconvenience that would resolve itself over time. It was the kind of thing that poisoned an entire working culture from the inside out. When the people at the very top were competing over money and status instead of working together towards shared professional goals, the environment shifted in ways that made the whole place genuinely unsafe for every person who had to work in it every night. McMahon listened, and he continued protecting his star. The warning signs had been accumulating for years before 1997 became the defining chapter of this story. There were real and documented incidents where anyone paying honest and careful attention could see the exact pattern Bret Hart had been describing. Theoretical concerns about possible futures. Actual events with actual consequences for real people whose careers and livelihoods were directly, permanently affected. The first significant incident happened in Syracuse, New York. Michaels had been out at a local bar after a show with Davey Boy Smith and Sean Waltman. His behavior during the evening became aggressive and disruptive in ways that attracted serious and unwanted attention from others present in the venue. The situation escalated and ended in a physical confrontation outside. A military officer beat Michaels severely in a parking lot altercation. His companions were in no condition to help him. They were far too heavily intoxicated to intervene or assist in any meaningful way. The WWF needed to protect their top star's public image and the company's investment in him, so they constructed a version of events that served those purposes cleanly. Official story presented to the public described an unprovoked ambush by 6 Marines that Michaels had done absolutely nothing to invite or provoke. The physical injuries Michaels sustained real, and they were serious. The account of how he came to have those injuries was not. Direct result was that Michaels could not compete. He was physically unable to defend the Intercontinental Championship and was forced to forfeit it entirely. An entire section of the company's carefully planned booking had to be dismantled and reconstructed from nothing because one man's personal behavior during a night off had produced a live on-screen crisis that the whole organization was forced to absorb and manage on his behalf. Bret looked at that entire sequence and saw something very specific and very troubling. The company had not simply covered for Michaels after the fact and moved on. They had deliberately and actively constructed a false public narrative to protect his image while he recovered from the consequences of his own behavior. They had absorbed responsibility that belonged entirely to him, and they had allowed him to walk away from those consequences without facing any of them directly or personally. That precedent, Bret argued clearly and with genuine urgency, was dangerous in the long term, because once a performer experiences through direct evidence that the organization will protect them from consequences regardless of what produced those consequences, the natural human response is simply to continue. There is no natural break. The company had communicated to Michaels through its own actions that there was no flaw beneath him, no level of personal conduct that would produce real accountability. That pattern that extended beyond individual incidents and into the shared understanding of what the locker room was. Every performer in that building was watching. The culture of a locker room is not made by policy documents or official announcements. It is made by what the people in authority do and do not respond to when things go wrong. McMahon was writing a very specific cultural document through his repeated inaction, and Bret Hart was the only person reading it out loud. Then came SummerSlam 1996. Michaels was defending the WWF Championship against Vader, whose real name was Leon White. By any fair and honest measure, Vader should have been a genuinely credible and threatening opponent for anyone on the roster. He was physically enormous. He was legitimately capable. He had built a real and well-earned reputation in every major territory he had worked in around the world, including Japan, the United States, and Europe. He was exactly the kind of opponent who should make a match feel genuinely competitive and genuinely dangerous. The plan was to give the audience a competitive and physically intense contest that presented Vader as a legitimate threat even in defeat. Both men were supposed to emerge from it with their standing credibly intact. What happened instead played out on live national television in front of a paying audience. At some point during the match, Vader missed a planned spot. These things happen in professional wrestling. The business is physical, imprecise, and performed under real pressure in real time with variables that cannot always be controlled. Missing spots is understood and expected by every working professional in the industry as part of the reality of live performance. What is not part of any professional code anywhere in wrestling is what Michaels chose to do in response. He screamed at Vader on live television. He threw a visible and sustained tantrum in front of the paying audience and the cameras broadcasting to viewers across the entire country. He threatened out loud to walk out of the match entirely. Every moment of it captured and transmitted in real time. Jim Ross, one of the most respected and knowledgeable voices in the history of professional wrestling, was thoroughly direct in his assessment of that night afterward. He called Michaels' behavior unprofessional in terms that left no room for a charitable interpretation. He also noted that Michaels was genuinely fortunate that Vader chose not to respond physically in that moment, because the outcome of that confrontation would have been completely different from anything Michaels was equipped to handle. Vader, despite his formidable reputation and his enormous physical presence, was a sensitive and genuinely proud person away from the performance environment. The public humiliation cut deeply into him in ways that were not small or temporary. His momentum inside the WWF collapsed almost immediately following that night. His confidence was broken in ways that showed clearly in everything he did from that point forward with the company. A career trajectory that had carried real potential and real promise was effectively ended by one man's failure to manage his own emotional reaction during a difficult stretch of a match. Bret watched all of it. He kept returning to the same essential observation and the same core warning. If the rules do not apply to the top star, the whole locker room rots. That was not rhetoric deployed for color or impact. It described something real and precise. When performers below the top of the hierarchy see that certain behavior goes completely unchallenged when comes from the person at the very peak, they are forced into uncomfortable conclusions about the actual nature of the standards they have been told to uphold. Either those standards were never genuinely real in the first place, or they apply selectively only to those who lack the leverage to escape them. Both conclusions are destructive in ways that compound over time. One removes the shared foundation that makes a locker room function as a genuine professional community. The other creates a deep and hardening resentment that does not soften or dissipate naturally. It accumulates. A locker room is a community built on interdependence. Every performer who steps through the ropes trusts at some fundamental level, the person working with them that night has accepted the same professional responsibilities they have when one person at the very top of that community is openly exempted from those responsibilities. The implicit agreement that holds everything together starts to crack. And cracks in something that depends on trust do not simply stay the size they started. They spread, they deepen, they find the weakest points and they work at them until something gives entirely. McMahon heard the warning. He kept protecting his star. As 1997 opened, the conflict between Bret and Michaels stopped being a matter of professional philosophy and became something far more personal and considerably more dangerous in its practical implications for everyone involved. Bret had grown openly uncomfortable with the direction the WWF product was taking. The company was pivoting toward an edgier and more deliberately provocative style of presentation, more vulgarity, more content that deliberately blurred the line between scripted entertainment and genuine personal hostility. Bret found this unnecessary and beneath the standards of the craft he had given his career to building and protecting. He was not quiet about it. At one public point, he described Michaels, Triple H, Chyna, and Rick Rude using a specific and pointed word. He called them degenerates. What Michaels did with that word demonstrated the kind of political intelligence that made him genuinely difficult to confront directly in the arena public perception. Rather than treating the insult as something requiring a defensive response, he owned it completely and built something lasting and effective out of it. He and Triple H constructed a faction around the very label Bret had used as criticism. They called themselves Degeneration X. The word Bret had intended as condemnation became their identity and their brand and their explicit statement of purpose. Bret had tried to use shame as a weapon, and they had converted that shame into armor and pointed it back at him with full confidence. His criticism had given them a gift they could not have manufactured on their own. Bret warned that this turn towards shock value and deliberate provocation at the expense of genuine in-ring storytelling was sending the product somewhere it would eventually regret going. He was told he was behind the times. The audience had evolved past what he was offering and wanted something more aggressive and less restrained. His view of wrestling was the view of a previous era that the company had outgrown. He disagreed and made his disagreement plain, but the gap between what he believed the business should represent and what management was actively choosing to pursue kept widening with every passing week and every new controversy. Then on the 19th of May 1997, during a live broadcast episode of Raw is War, Michaels crossed a line that had absolutely nothing to do with professional differences and everything to do with deliberate and calculated personal cruelty. He delivered what became known simply as the Sunny Days promo. On live national television, looking directly into the camera, Michaels made unmistakable implications, accusing Bret Hart of having a personal affair with WF personality Sunny, whose real name was Tammy Sitch. Promo had not been sanctioned by management. Nobody had cleared it beforehand or given any approval for the content that was delivered. What made the promo genuinely reprehensible beyond its surface content was something the viewing audience at home had absolutely no way of knowing. It was Shawn Michaels himself who had been involved with Tammy Sitch in real life. He was the one actually engaged in the relationship he was publicly and falsely accusing Bret of having. He had taken something that was genuinely and demonstrably true about his own private life, directed it at a completely innocent man, broadcast it on live television to the entire country. Bret's wife, Julie, was watching that evening. She took the accusation personally, and she took it with real pain. The promo put genuine and lasting strain on their marriage that extended far beyond anything that could be fairly categorized as a professional disagreement. Bret was not the kind of man who absorbed something like that and moved quietly forward without response. On the 9th of June 1997, backstage in Hartford, Connecticut, he confronted Michaels directly and in person. The confrontation became physical almost instantly. Bret dominated it. He physically overpowered Michaels in the altercation and, in the process, ripped out a substantial chunk of Michaels' hair. It was not a polished or controlled encounter. It was raw and it was witnessed. What followed demonstrated how precisely Michaels had learned to convert a personal defeat into lasting political capital. He went directly to McMahon. He complained that he was being subjected to a hostile working environment that made it impossible for him to feel professionally safe or protected. He indicated that continuing to work under these conditions indefinitely was not something he was prepared to do. He threatened to quit the company entirely. Management pulled him from television while the situation was managed and contained. Consider that sequence from start to finish. Michaels had launched a deliberately cruel public attack on Bret's marriage, using a lie he personally knew to be hypocritical because he was the one who was actually guilty of what he was alleging. He had provoked a physical confrontation through his own chosen behavior. He had come off badly from that confrontation in every objective measure, and the result of the entire chain was that he was treated as the aggrieved and protected party who required management's full attention and care. Consistent and documented warnings about this exact dynamic were once again set aside by management that could not afford to lose its top star. The summer of 1997 moved the entire story toward a point from which there was genuinely no return. WWF Championship sat at the center of every conversation and every decision being made at the top of the company. Bret held it. Michaels was positioned as the challenger. Their match at the Survivor Series in Montreal was being constructed as the culmination of everything that had been building between these two men across years of professional friction and personal conflict. But beneath the visible surface of the storyline, a separate and far more consequential series of events was unfolding that would ultimately determine what actually happened in that ring. On the 12th of October, 1997, backstage in San Jose, California, Bret Hart did something that required real professional courage and genuine personal integrity. He sought out Michaels directly and initiated a direct and honest conversation about what was coming at Survivor Series. He told him without conditions or qualifications or any room for misinterpretation that if Vince McMahon asked him to lose the WWF Championship to Michaels at Survivor Series, he would do it. No objection, no negotiation, no conditions attached. He would honor his professional obligation and he would put Michaels over cleanly. That was the code of the business. It was what being a professional in this industry fundamentally meant. He then asked Michaels a single direct question. If the situation were completely reversed and McMahon asked Michaels to lose the championship to Bret, would he be willing to do it? Michaels told him no. He said it without hesitation and without any visible discomfort about the implications of what he was openly admitting. He would not drop the title to Bret Hart. That was his answer, and it was final. Single exchange became the pivot point around which everything else in this story turned. Bret's subsequent decision to refuse to lose the championship was not an act of professional ego. It was not stubbornness or personal vanity. It was a principled response to a colleague who had stated openly and without ambiguity that the basic professional covenant of the wrestling business simply did not apply to him when the personal costs were real. Michaels had said it with his own mouth. He would participate in the system when it benefited him and opt of its obligations when his own interests pointed in a different direction. Bret held a creative control clause within his contract. It was a genuine and legally binding provision. McMahon had included it as part of the terms that had brought Bret back to the company and secured his long-term commitment. Clause gave Bret specific contractual rights to refuse certain booking decisions under defined circumstances. Losing the WWF Championship championship to a man who had just explicitly stated he would never offer the same professional courtesy in return in Canada, in front of Canadian audiences for whom Bret Hart carried genuine and significant national meaning, fell entirely within what that clause existed to protect. His refusal was principled. It was professionally reasonable. It was legally supported by a contract McMahon himself had signed. And it was, in the end, completely irrelevant by what McMahon had already decided to do, regardless of what any contract said. The arena in Montreal was packed to its full capacity that night, and the atmosphere inside was intensely and vocally partisan in Bret's favor. Bret Hart meant something to those fans that went far beyond the ordinary relationship between a performer and an audience that had paid to see them. When Michaels applied the sharpshooter to Bret, using the exact hold that Vader had specifically warned him to avoid at all costs, the crowd tensed visibly but held their faith in their man, had watched Bret Hart escape from difficult positions for years. They were waiting with confidence for the reversal they had every reason to expect was imminent. The noise of that building in those seconds was the noise of a crowd that fully believed in the man they had come to support. Trust was total and genuine, and it was about to be used against everyone in the building who held it. The referee, the timekeeper, the man collecting the salary McMahon paid him were all participants in something that had been planned weeks in advance. Earl Hebner looked toward Vince McMahon, positioned at ringside. He gave the signal. The timekeeper rang the bell immediately. Bret Hart had not submitted. He had not tapped out. He had not given any signal or indication whatsoever of surrender or defeat. The match was ended without his consent. Using his own signature hold, the championship was taken from him in his own country, in front of his own people, through a conspiracy that had been quietly assembled beneath every agreement and every conversation for weeks. Michaels seized the championship belt and was escorted rapidly from the arena. Bret Hart stood in that ring, looking like a man standing in the middle of a world that had simply lost its coherence entirely. He turned toward McMahon at ringside and spat directly in his face. Then he moved deliberately to the television broadcast equipment, positioned around the ring, and destroyed it, methodically, in full view of every camera still rolling and every person still remaining in that arena. Bret walked back through the curtain, carrying what he later described as very dark thoughts, feeling like a ticking time bomb moving steadily toward McMahon's locked office door. He named the pattern. He described precisely where it was leading. He was dismissed as a jealous colleague, as an outdated traditionalist whose time had passed, as a man whose legitimate professional concerns could be attributed to nothing more than personal rivalry. And then in Montreal, packed arena full of people who believed in him completely, in his own country, using his own finishing hold through the hands of a referee who had sworn on his children that he would never participate in this. The exact outcome Bret Hart had described arrived exactly on schedule. He knew. He said it clearly and plainly and repeatedly. Nobody listened in time, and the wrestling business was permanently and irreversibly changed by the full price of that choice. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell us what you think the real turning point was in all of this. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you on the next one.
Like, I wasn't used to the trauma of that you get during a wrestling match, and especially a wrestling match with Brock Lesnar. There's not a lot of people that pick me up and throw me around like he was able to.
The Undertaker warned us about Brock Lesnar, but nobody listened. For 30 years, Mark Calloway stood as the conscience of the WWE locker room. He judged, he protected, he enforced the code. Vince McMahon spent those same 30 years building a corporate empire through total commercial control. But here is the problem. In May 2026, the company is being dragged back toward full-time stars and story-driven television. The shift is not a choice, it is survival. The part-time mercenary blueprint left scar tissue everywhere. Undertaker saw it coming. He warned the office that building around an untouchable attraction would destroy morale and bury the stars of tomorrow. They handed Brock Lesnar a blank check anyway. If you are enjoying this breakdown, give hype to the video and let the algorithm know this story matters. So, how did it get this far? And who paid the price? Understanding what went wrong means understanding what Undertaker represented. The locker room was not just a place to change clothes. It was a culture. It was a brotherhood. brotherhood. It was a code passed down through generations of performers who understood that professional wrestling required more than athletic ability. It required trust. It required sacrifice. It required putting the business ahead of personal ambition. Undertaker ran this culture with old-school rules that seemed harsh to outsiders, but served a vital purpose for everyone inside. You respected your opponent in the ring and protected them during matches because their safety was your responsibility. You carried the brand most days of the year, grinding through hundreds of towns, performing hurt, missing birthdays and anniversaries because that was the job. You passed the torch when your time came instead of hoarding the spotlight because the business survived through generations, not individuals. Loyalty mattered more than money. The grind mattered more than comfort. Showing up mattered more than excuses. These were not suggestions. They were the foundation of everything. Wrestlers' Court existed to enforce those values and keep the culture intact. Undertaker sat as judge, presiding over trials that ranged from silly disputes to serious breaches of locker room protocol. If you disrespected a veteran or broke the unwritten code, you faced consequences. The Miz once spilled food on a veteran's bag during a flight. It sounds minor. It was not. He got shunned from the locker room and forced to change in hallways and bathroom stalls for weeks. The punishment taught him to respect communal spaces and the people who came before him. Melina faced trial early in her career for seeming aloof and failing to interact properly with established veterans. The court forced her to integrate and earn her place. Edge and Christian got accused of politicking and trying to bribe head writer Brian Gewirtz for extra television time. They brought Undertaker a bottle of Jack Daniels as penance, and the boys popped so hard that the case got thrown out amid laughter. Even the head writer himself had to stand trial alongside them to address locker room concerns that creative opportunities were being distributed based on personal friendships rather than merit and performance. The system worked because it applied to everyone. It kept the humble performers humble. It kept the pushed stars accountable. No matter how high you climbed the card, no matter how many championships you held, the locker room still mattered. You were still part of the collective. You still owed respect to your peers. Brock Lesnar never fit that culture. He was transactional from the very start. Clinical, detached, calculating, promoted as the next big thing. When he arrived in 2002, he rose faster than anyone in modern WWE history. He beat The Rock at SummerSlam to become the youngest WWE champion ever. He beat Hulk Hogan. He beat Undertaker himself. Within months, he became the undisputed focal point of the company's entire future. WWE invested massive financial capital and creative focus into making him the face of the next generation. Vince McMahon saw him as the ultimate physical specimen. Young, powerful, marketable, legitimate. The plan was for Brock to carry the company for the next 15 years. But the grind wore him down faster than anyone anticipated. The relentless travel schedule crushed him physically and mentally. Over 300 days a year on the road, flying from city to city, sleeping in hotels, performing through injuries, missing his family. The lifestyle that defined professional wrestling became unbearable for someone who had not grown up dreaming of this specific world. After WrestleMania 20 in 2004, Brock made his choice. He walked away from millions of dollars guaranteed. He walked away from the main event spotlight. He wanted to chase the NFL despite never playing college football. He wanted to explore other athletic paths. He wanted out of wrestling completely. The locker room erupted with resentment and fury. They felt deeply and personally betrayed. WWE had given him everything imaginable, the biggest push in company history, victories over every legend who mattered, the championship, the platform, the money, the opportunity, and he turned his back on the business without looking back. Most of the roster held severe, lasting heat toward him. They saw him as disloyal. They saw him as selfish. They saw him as someone who took everything the business offered and gave nothing back. Wrestlers who had ground for years to earn a fraction of what Brock was handed watched him abandon it all for uncertain pursuits. The bitterness was profound and widespread. Undertaker took a different stance that shocked many in the locker room. He pulled Brock aside privately and gave him pragmatic, almost fatherly advice. He told him to go. He told him to explore those dreams and athletic ambitions. He warned that if Brock did not chase the NFL and UFC opportunities while he was young enough, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. It was compassionate counsel from a man who understood the pull of ambition and the weight of regret. It let Brock leave without a personal grudge from the most respected figure in the company, but it also left a massive vacuum. Long-term booking strategies collapsed overnight. Plans that assumed Brock would anchor the main event for years had to be completely torn up. The creative disruption was enormous. The immediate fallout played out at WrestleMania 20 itself in front of the world. Brock faced Goldberg in what should have been a dream marquee match between two monsters. Both men were leaving the company. News of their departures leaked just before the show. The live crowd in Madison Square Garden gave them absolutely nuclear heat. Hostile, angry, bitter. They felt cheated by performers who were taking their money and walking away. The match turned into a complete disaster. Fans chanted for Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was serving as special referee instead of watching the competitors. They booed every single move. They rejected everything. The locker room watched backstage with a mixture of shock, amusement, and professional dismay. Industry figures like Jim Cornette privately warned Brock about the extreme level of hostility his sudden exit had generated among the active roster. Cornette emphasized that while nobody would risk a legitimate physical altercation with a combatant of Brock's size and skill, the underlying professional resentment was profound and would not fade quickly. Brock had burned bridges. He had violated the code. He had taken everything and given back nothing. The locker room would remember for years. 6 years passed. Brock pursued the NFL and failed to make a roster. He pursued UFC and succeeded beyond expectations. He became the UFC heavyweight champion. He became one of the biggest pay-per-view draws in mixed martial arts history. He proved he was a legitimate fighter, not just a sports entertainment performer. He validated his decision to leave, but he also proved something else that Undertaker had seen clearly. His loyalty was always to his own brand first. His commitment was always conditional. His dedication was always measured against other opportunities. In October 2010, everything shifted dramatically. At UFC 121, Brock lost his heavyweight title to Cain Velasquez in a brutal, one-sided beating. Afterwards, as Brock walked past a post-fight interview area, something unexpected happened. Undertaker was there. He was being interviewed by sports journalist Ariel Helwani. As Brock walked past, Undertaker stared him down with that legendary intensity. The words came out cold and clear and deliberate. "Do you want to do it?" The moment exploded instantly across both the MMA and wrestling worlds. Fans went absolutely wild. Social media erupted. It felt spontaneous. It felt real. It felt like two alpha males about to collide. Years later, the full truth came out through interviews and documentary. It was not spontaneous at all. WWE had specifically deployed Undertaker to pick a fight on Brock's current athletic home turf. The goal was simple and calculated. Lure him back to wrestling. Create a spectacle. Generate buzz. Get him thinking about returning. Undertaker knew his own days of legitimately competing in an MMA cage had long passed. He was in his mid-40s. He had decades of accumulated wrestling injuries, but he recognized the immense commercial potential of leveraging their shared history to create cross-promotional interest and plant the seed. The plan had one significant operational problem. Undertaker operated under the explicit assumption that Vince McMahon and UFC President Dana White had prearranged the confrontation together as promotional partners. They had not. Dana White was completely unaware of the planned interaction. He knew nothing about it. Undertaker felt deeply apologetic afterward for crossing that operational boundary and putting Dana in an awkward position with his own fighter. The professional relationship could have been damaged, but despite the administrative awkwardness and miscommunication, the gambit succeeded perfectly. The chain of events it started led directly to Brock's return to WWE in 2012. This time, he came back with leverage that no returning performer had ever possessed. The structural and cultural breaking point came at WrestleMania 30. The streak had stood for over 2 decades as a sacred institution. 21 victories and 0 defeats. It was an unofficial main event every single year. It was a respected tradition that transcended normal booking. It drove ticket sales. It anchored WrestleMania marketing. Fans traveled across the world specifically to see if someone would finally end it. On April 6, 2014, Undertaker arrived at the Superdome in New Orleans expecting to defeat Brock Lesnar and extend the streak to 22-0. 4 hours before showtime, Vince McMahon called him aside and changed the finish. Brock would end the streak. Undertaker did not veto the decision, despite having the backstage power and respect to do so. His professional philosophy had always been clear and consistent. Business considerations must supersede personal desires and legacy protection. He had put countless people over during his career. He had done jobs when asked. He trusted Vince's judgment on big-picture creative decisions. But he asked Vince one direct question before agreeing. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Vince said yes without hesitation. He argued forcefully that if not Brock, there was nobody on the current active roster who was believable enough to accomplish the feat. Nobody had the credibility. Nobody had the aura. Nobody else could make it mean something significant. Undertaker accepted the decision, but privately harbored serious reservations. He thought a full-time rising star like Roman Reigns would benefit far more from receiving that monumental rub. Roman was young. Roman was being positioned as the next face of the company. Roman needed the credibility and the moment. Giving the streak to Brock felt like using the most valuable currency in the business to buy something you already owned. Brock was already established. Brock was already a legend. Brock was already made. The streak would not fundamentally change his career trajectory. It would just be another accolade. But for a young, full-time star trying to break through to the main event level, it could be career-defining and transformative. The match went ahead as planned. During it, Undertaker suffered a severe concussion that left him disoriented and struggling. He was hospitalized immediately after the match finished. Vince McMahon left WrestleMania before the show ended to accompany his longtime star to the hospital. Meanwhile, the locker room reaction backstage was a mixture of genuine shock, fury, and professional dismay. Most of the guys were absolutely pissed. They could not believe what they had just witnessed. They felt a vital and irreplaceable part of WrestleMania tradition had been destroyed for no good reason. The performers who had helped build the streak over the years by putting Undertaker over felt personally disrespected. They had all done their part to make it special. They had all contributed to making it mean something. And now it was gone. Given to someone who was not even there full time. Given to someone who had already abandoned them once before. The executive logic behind the decision tied directly to creative chaos elsewhere on the WrestleMania card. Originally, WWE had built the entire WrestleMania 30 season and storyline around the return of Batista. He was supposed to win the Royal Rumble. He was supposed to challenge for the WWE Championship in the main event. He was supposed to leave WrestleMania as champion and carry the company forward. But fan support for Daniel Bryan exploded into a movement that could not be controlled or redirected. The Yes movement became a genuine cultural phenomenon. Fans hijacked shows. They chanted for Bryan constantly and relentlessly. They completely rejected the Batista plan. The company had no choice but to restructure everything at the absolute last minute. Vince decided if Daniel Bryan was going to leave WrestleMania as WWE champion, after forcing that creative change, then Brock Lesnar needed to be elevated to an unassailable level of dominance to balance the scales and anchor the other side of the card. Ending the streak would create that instantly. It would make Brock absolutely unstoppable. It would make him the ultimate heel force. The financial implications were staggering. The streak had been leveraged for merchandise, ticket sales, and WrestleMania branding for over 20 years. It had generated countless millions in revenue. Fans bought tickets specifically to witness history continue. They purchased commemorative programs. They bought streak-themed merchandise. The economic value was immense and proven. Ending it created a one-time shocking moment. Preserving it would have continued generating value indefinitely. But Vince believed the shock value outweighed the long-term equity. He believed creating an unstoppable monster was worth more than maintaining tradition. History would prove that calculation wrong. The legendary streak's value as an ongoing attraction far exceeded its value as a sacrifice to elevate someone who did not need elevating. The plan was for Brock to defeat Bryan later that summer in a massacre-style match that would cement Brock as the towering villain to anchor the main event scene for years. On paper, the corporate logic made perfect sense. In practice, it violated the most fundamental locker room rule that everyone understood. Use the streak to raise a full-time star who desperately needs it. Give it to someone who is building their career and legacy. Do not waste it on someone who is already made and works part-time. Giving it to Brock felt like throwing away the single most valuable piece of capital the company possessed. But Vince was certain. So it happened. What followed was a full decade of systematic damage to the full-time roster and the championship structure. SummerSlam 2014 arrived just 4 months after WrestleMania. Brock faced John Cena for the WWE Championship. The match was not a competitive back-and-forth battle. It was a mechanical demolition. Suplex after suplex after suplex. 16 German suplexes in total. Cena, the company's top star and absolute workhorse for nearly a decade, got completely destroyed. He barely got any offensive moves. He was made to look utterly helpless against Brock's dominance. Brock won the title decisively and became WWE champion. Then he disappeared from television. He worked an absolutely tiny fraction of the dates that previous champions had worked. The championship became an invisible prop that fans rarely saw. It vanished from television for weeks or even months at a time. Full-time performers fought desperately for Intercontinental Championships and United States Championships, while the top prize in the entire company was held hostage by someone who appeared once every few weeks at absolute best. The class divide became completely undeniable and increasingly toxic. Brock's contract was estimated at $12 million annually according to industry reports. Additional reports suggested he earned approximately $167,000 per individual television appearance and $650,000 per pay-per-view match. Add in substantial merchandise revenue shares on top of those appearance fees. Meanwhile, full-time talent carried the absolutely brutal daily touring burden. They worked hundreds of live events every single year. They traveled constantly from city to city and country to country. They performed through injuries that should have required surgery and recovery time. They missed family weddings, birthdays, anniversaries, and countless other life events. They did absolutely everything the business demanded without complaint or hesitation, and they earned a small fraction of what Brock made for his occasional appearances. They were told explicitly through that compensation structure that their dedication and presence meant less than his sporadic involvement. The message absolutely destroyed morale across the entire roster. The human cost played out in genuinely heartbreaking fashion again and again. Kofi Kingston spent over a decade as an incredibly loyal, hard-working performer. He was a true workhorse who never complained about his position. He took every loss professionally. He did every job he was asked to do. He worked every single town on the schedule. He was a locker room leader who actively helped younger talent develop. He was beloved by peers and fans alike for his infectious positivity and relentless work ethic. In early 2019, fan support for him exploded organically into a genuine movement. The Kofi Mania phenomenon became absolutely real and undeniable. Fans demanded he get a WWE Championship opportunity. Social media erupted with support. Arenas chanted his name constantly. WWE finally listened. At WrestleMania 35, Kofi defeated Daniel Bryan to win the WWE Championship in an emotional, genuinely cathartic moment. It felt completely and authentically earned. It felt real in a way very few moments do. 6 months later, SmackDown debuted on the Fox network. WWE desperately wanted a shocking mainstream moment to grab headlines, attract casual viewers, and generate social media buzz. They wanted something that would trend immediately. They booked Kofi to defend his WWE Championship against Brock Lesnar on that debut episode. The match lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds to completely erase 6 months of championship reign and 11 full years of grinding and dedication. Brock hit one F5 finishing move and pinned him cleanly. The championship that Kofi had carried with genuine pride and honor for months was gone in an instant. The months of careful storytelling investment were erased. The emotional payoff was demolished. The locker room was absolutely devastated by what they witnessed. Peers did not blame Brock personally for simply executing what he was told to do. They understood he was following orders and collecting his contracted pay. But they blamed the creative decision with absolute fury. They felt months of careful storytelling and over a decade of loyal, grinding work ethic had been casually dismissed and thrown away for a brief ratings pop that would be completely forgotten within days. The short-sightedness was staggering. Prominent tag team wrestlers immediately sent private messages of apology and support to Kofi. It reflected collective grief and anger across the entire roster. The championship itself felt devalued as an institution. The title that should represent the absolute pinnacle of professional achievement felt cheapened. The message to everyone watching backstage was brutal and crystal clear. No amount of dedication can ultimately protect you from being sacrificed. No amount of fan connection or organic support truly matters when corporate priorities suddenly shift. If Vince wants a shocking moment, your reign ends instantly to service that goal. Braun Strowman suffered an equally damaging parallel fate. By 2017, he had emerged as a genuinely homegrown giant with real organic crowd momentum. Fans absolutely loved watching him flip ambulances and destroy everything in his path. He had natural charisma. He had genuine presence. He felt like an obvious natural successor to Brock as an unstoppable monster. At No Mercy 2017, Braun faced Brock for the Universal Championship. The match ended relatively quickly with Brock winning decisively. It dampened Braun's immediate appeal but did not completely kill his momentum. The truly critical failure came exactly 1 year later. At Crown Jewel 2018, a match was scheduled to crown a new Universal Champion because Roman Reigns had vacated the title due to his leukemia diagnosis. The creative writing staff was told explicitly and repeatedly that Braun Strowman was winning the championship. They wrote the entire next episode of Monday Night Raw around that. Then Vince reversed it and put the title on Brock. The writers scrambled to rewrite everything. Braun never captured the title at his peak. His trajectory was permanently altered. The Braun situation exposed another fundamental flaw in the system. The company could not commit to building new stars because they were too dependent on the established attraction. Every time a new star started gaining traction, the instinct was to feed them to Brock rather than elevate them past him. This created a ceiling that nobody could break through. Braun was the most obvious example, but the pattern repeated with others. The system was structurally designed to prevent new megastars from emerging. It protected the status quo at the expense of the future. WWE became trapped in their own creation. The pattern repeated itself across the roster in different forms. Momentum got arbitrarily halted. Carefully constructed, long-term plans got suddenly scrapped to accommodate short-term Brock angles. Last minute, creative rewrites became accepted as completely normal operating procedure. Creative teams grew increasingly frustrated with the chaos and instability. Full-time performers grew progressively more bitter and disillusioned with the entire system. The locker room culture that Undertaker had spent decades building and protecting continued to erode steadily. All of it was done to maintain Brock's carefully constructed aura as the unstoppable final boss who existed completely above everyone else. The contractual gap between Brock and everyone else told the entire story in stark numerical terms. Brock worked strictly limited part-time dates. Over a full 10-year span from 2012 to 2022, he wrestled only 63 televised matches total, 63 matches in 10 full years. Full-time performers worked that many matches in just 3 or 4 months of regular touring. They did year-round domestic tours covering every market. They did international tours. They worked live events in front of small crowds that would never be televised or generate pay-per-view revenue. They put their bodies through absolute hell night after night. Brock was completely exempt from all of it. He was also completely exempt from standard backstage disciplinary channels and accountability. He had almost no presence whatsoever in the day-to-day locker room environment. He flew in specifically for shows and left immediately afterward. He was not there for the grinding travel. He was not there for the camaraderie and bonding. He was not there for the culture. He was completely immune to the peer-led accountability system that Undertaker had spent his entire career enforcing and protecting. He had high-level booking veto power that let him protect himself creatively in ways nobody else on the roster could even dream of. He frequently ended full-time stars' momentum to keep his own position absolutely secure and untouchable. Meanwhile, the active roster was constantly subject to rapid creative changes and unceremonious losses with absolutely no ability to push back or protect themselves. They had zero protection. The system created two completely distinct classes: part-time aristocracy floating above. The psychological impact on the locker room cannot be overstated. Imagine working 300 days per year, sacrificing your body and family time, doing everything asked professionally, and watching someone work 30 days while earning 10 times your salary. Imagine being told you are not worthy, but the part-timer who already left is. Imagine building momentum with fans, connecting authentically, generating organic reactions, then having that momentum killed to protect someone who barely shows up. That psychological damage compounds over time. It breeds resentment and kills passion. It makes people question why they sacrifice so much for a business that values them so little. The numbers and emotions told the story. Full-time trench workers grinding below. Wrestlers caught as an institution could not touch Brock at all. The system that had kept even the biggest pushed stars humble and accountable to their peers had absolutely no power over him. When Vince said only Brock was worthy enough to end the streak, he sent a devastating message to the entire full-time roster. He told them explicitly they were sub-elite. He told them they fundamentally lacked the inherent star power and credibility of previous generations. He told them they would never truly measure up, no matter how hard they worked. The active roster had to watch a man who had once completely abandoned the company return years later to claim its ultimate narrative prize while remaining totally detached from all the social obligations and codes of the locker room. The traditional locker room hierarchy eroded completely. A community that had been built on generations of shared labor and mutual respect gave way to a cold, corporate, mercenary ecosystem dominated entirely by special preferential treatment and exceptionalism. The irony of Undertaker's personal role in all of this cuts extraordinarily deep when examined closely. In 2004, he gave Brock compassionate, fatherly advice to walk away and pursue his dreams to avoid a lifetime of regret. In 2010, he actively allowed himself to be used as promotional bait at UFC 121 to strategically lure Brock back to wrestling. In 2014, he consented to the streak ending and professionally put Brock over on the biggest possible stage. Each individual decision made perfect sense when viewed in isolation. Each decision reflected Undertaker's deep professionalism and his consistent willingness to put business considerations first. But when viewed together as a connected sequence, those three decisions helped directly construct a system that fundamentally compromised the very locker room culture Undertaker had protected and enforced for 3 full decades. The decision to deliberately build WWE's entire creative philosophy around a part-time, highly compensated attraction permanently altered how the company operated at every level. It systematically devalued active championships by making them completely invisible for long stretches of time. It decimated the momentum of organic, full-time rising stars like Kofi Kingston and Braun Strowman, who absolutely should have become the next generation of megastars. It replaced the traditional peer-led accountability system of wrestlers' court with an untouchable class of mercenary performers who answered to nobody except Vince personally. In his genuine effort to help secure a singular attraction for the business and support the company's success, the single greatest locker room leader in WWE history inadvertently paved the way for a structural paradigm that systematically diminished the value of the full-time roster and left lasting, visible damage across the entire industry. The creative monotony became absolutely suffocating for everyone involved in the process. The exact same blueprint repeated endlessly for years. Brock shows up occasionally. Brock dominates completely. Brock disappears for months. The championship vanishes from television. Full-time performers desperately fight for mid-card scraps. The cycle repeats without variation. Audiences gradually grew tired of the predictable pattern. Ratings reflected the mounting fatigue. The locker room grew increasingly bitter about the situation. The damage compounded steadily, year after year. Stars who absolutely should have been systematically built were instead sacrificed to maintain the status quo. Opportunities that could have created genuine new mainstream icons were completely wasted on endlessly repeating the same Brock formula. The product stagnated creative. Viewership declined steadily. The company kept stubbornly doubling down on the same approach anyway. They kept believing the Mercenary model was sustainable even as mounting evidence proved it was fundamentally not. They kept deliberately ignoring what Undertaker had clearly seen from the very beginning. Relying on someone whose loyalty was purely conditional and who actively wanted out of the grinding lifestyle was fundamentally unstable. Building creative entirely around someone who was completely untouchable by normal locker room standards and accountability was deeply corrosive to culture. Sacrificing the long-term systematic development of the future for the short-term appeal of a temporary attraction was strategically short-sighted. The scar tissue from that entire era runs extraordinarily deep, even now in 2026. An entire generation of talented performers saw their absolute primes disrupted and their potential artificially capped. Wrestlers who could have and absolutely should have become genuine megastars got permanently caught in the holding pattern created by Brock's extended absences and dominance. The championship belt that should have systematically elevated multiple new stars became nothing more than a prop for someone who barely appeared on television. The story of Undertaker and Brock Lesnar is ultimately a story about choices and their consequences, about warnings that were ignored and prices that were paid, about culture that was eroded and is now being slowly rebuilt, about the real cost of prioritizing mercenaries over the full-time grind, about learning lessons the hardest possible way, about scar tissue that remains even after healing begins. It is a story about how the greatest locker room leader in WWE history warned everyone about the structural rot that was coming, how he saw the damage clearly before it happened, how he tried in his way to prevent it, and how he ended up helping create it anyway through decisions that seemed right at the time but proved catastrophic in combination. The May 2026 shift back toward full-time stars as the foundation proves he was right from the start. The part-time mercenary blueprint failed. The damage it caused was real and measurable. The years it cost cannot be recovered, but the lesson has finally been learned. The company is rebuilding properly now. It is investing in full-time talent. It is respecting the grind. It is creating sustainable culture again. It is building stars the right way. The future future looks brighter specifically because the past taught such a painful lesson. Undertaker warned us about Brock Lesnar and what building around him would cost. Nobody listened. 10 years later, everyone finally understands why they should have. The warning was real. The damage was predictable. The lesson was painful, but it has finally been learned. If you made it this far, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into wrestling history. Drop a comment below with your take. Should the streak have stayed intact, or should it have been used to raise a full-time hero like Roman Reigns instead? The debate still matters because the lesson still resonates. Thanks for watching.